Hi everyone, now I will show you how did I create the truth table of my statement and conditional. I hope you understand.
Here's my statement. If he bought bread, then he went to the store. He bought bread, therefore, he went to the store. Consider the argument. The first premise of the argument is if he bought bread, then he went to the store. The second premise, he bought bread. And the conclusion, he went to the store. While this statement is obviously a valid argument, we can analyze it using a truth table by representing each of the premises together imply the conclusion. If the truth table is tautology, or we can say always true, then the argument is valid. Next, in symbolic form, I used variable p and q as represent my argument. So let's have the variable p that represent he bought bread, and the variable q represent he went to the store. So the argument becomes the first premise, p implies the variable q, and the second premise is the variable p, and the conclusion is the variable q. To test the validity of the argument, I look at whether the combination of the premise implies the conclusion. So, is it true that the combination of both premise implies the conclusion? So, let's go to the truth table. Truth table of the combination of both premise implies Q. So the first row is divided into fifth column, or divided into 5 columns. First is the variable p, the variable q, and the variable p implies variable q. Next, the first premise and the second premise. Next, the combination of first and second premise implies the conclusion. Next, to determine the first premise, whether it is true or false. So first, we have here in the first row, if we have true in P and we have true in Q, so we could say true implies true is true, and it follows true implies false is false, false implies true is true, and false implies false is true. Next, in this column, the combination of first premise and the second premise to determine this one whether this is true or false. If our first premise is true and our second premise is true, so we have true, and it follows if we have false in the first premise and true and second premise, so we have false. Next, if our first premise is true and our second premise is false, we have false. Next, if we have true in the first premise and false in the second premise, we have false. Next, so the last column, you have for the symbolic form, the combination of the both premise implies the conclusion. So to determine this one, if this is true, so we have here the first premise is true and the variable q is true, so true implies true is true. So
we have here, so our first and second premise is true and implies to variable q. So true implies the variable q is true. So true implies true is true. So mao nang nakuha nato ning true. Next, if our first or second first and second premise is false and our variable q is false, so false implies false is true. So we have here false implies q and false implies the variable q is false. So false implies false is true because of the role of conditional statement. Next, if our both premise is false and our variable q is true, our conclusion kibali is true. So false implies true is true and false implies false is true. So since the truth table of combination of both premise implies the conclusion is always true, we can see here and here. So this argument is valid.
So this explanation is all about biconditional. So my statement goes like this. I will graduate on time if and only if I will pass all the subjects this semester. I will pass all the subjects this semester, therefore I will graduate on time. So my symbolic form is P if and only if Q, which is my first premise, states that I will graduate on time. And my second premise is Q, states that I will pass all the subjects this semester. So my conclusion is, therefore, I will graduate on time. So this is the truth table of biconditional. My first premise, P if and only if Q, states that true, false, false, true. Then my second premise, Q, states true, false, true, false. Then my conclusion, true, true, false, false, which it determines that my argument is valid because my first and my second premise is true and my conclusion is true. So this argument is valid.
So this is my argument. If it is sweet, then I will eat it. It is not sweet, therefore I will not eat it. Let R represent my statement, it is sweet, and G represent my statement, I will eat it. So this is my symbolic form of the argument. R implies G, which is my first premise, and negation of R, which is my second premise. Therefore, negation of G, which is my conclusion. Here is my truth table of first premise. True, false, true, and true. Here is my second premise truth table, which is negation of R. False, false, true, true. And lastly, this is my conclusion, negation of G. False, 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 true, false, true. In the third row, I noticed that my conclusion is false and my premises are both true. So, because the conclusion in row 3 is false and the premises are both true, my argument is invalid.
Hey everyone, my name is Jelana Afial and I'm from Group 7 and this is my output for this activity. Let P and Q represent the following statements. P, red is a color. Q, apple is red. And for my argument statement, if red is a color, then apple is red. Red is not a color, therefore apple is not red. This is for my symbolic form. Now, let's go to the truth table so we can determine if my argument is invalid or valid. So here is my truth table. As you can see, I have the P, Q, the first premise, which is the if P then Q, the second premise, the negation of P, and the conclusion, the negation of Q. And in here in the first, in the P, I have two truths and two false. In Q, I have TF, TF. And in my first premise, the result is I have TF, FT. And in my second premise, the negation of P, I have the F, F, T, and T. In my conclusion, the negation of Q, I have F, T, F, F. So let's check if my argument is valid or invalid. In my first column, in the first premise, I have T. The second premise, I have F. And the conclusion is F, which is in no. In my second column, in first premise, I have F. And the second premise, I have F. And the conclusion, I have truth, which is again a no, since both of my premises are false. In my third column, I have F and T, and my conclusion is false. And in the last column, in the fourth column, I have two truths. In my first premise, I have truth, and in my second premise, I have truth. But still, my conclusion is F, and still it is a no, since the conclusion, the result is false. So therefore, my conclusion,
my argument is the tournament will take place tomorrow if and only if the weather is good. The weather is good, therefore the tournament will take place tomorrow. The symbolic form of this is P if and only if Q is the first premise, whereas the tournament will take place tomorrow. And the Q is the second premise, whereas the weather is good. So, my conclusion is P, whereas the tournament will take place tomorrow. My first premise states true, false, false, true, while my second premise states true, false, true, false. By looking at the table, in my first premise and second premise in the first row, both are true. So my conclusion is also true. Therefore, my argument is valid.
Here's my statement. If I study well, then I will pass my exam. I study well, therefore I pass my exam. Symbolic form. First premise is P implies Q. If I study well, then I will pass my exam. Second premise, P, I study well. Conclusion, Q, I pass my exam. Here's my truth table. First premise is P implies Q. T, true. False, true, true. Second premise, P, true, true, false, false. Conclusion, Q, true, false, true, false. As you can see, row 1 is the only row in which all the premises are true. So it is the only row that I examined. Because the conclusion is true in row 1, the argument is valid.